Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today, I'm talking about some great albums that are turning 25 in 2025. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So 2000 was a very pivotal point in music. You had the rise in digital music with Napster and file sharing, all the lawsuits and everything that went on around that. You had this huge rise in pop music that really kind of took hold in the later part of the 90s, but by 2000, it was the dominant force in music. And rock music had even splintered in a bunch of different directions also. You had the rise of nu metal, and you had MTV as the dominant force, really kind of drove popular mainstream music, for, the next several years. But there are also some incredible albums that came out in 2000, celebrating the 25th anniversary this year. I'm sure we'll see some anniversary releases come out over the course of the year, but first one came out back on February 8th, and that is Three Doors Down, The Better Life. This was their debut album. Kryptonite was the huge track off of this one. And even though it was kind of commercially it was really successful, but it got a lot of really mixed reviews when it came out. It sold over 7 million copies here in the U.S. It hit number 7 on the Billboard 200. I think it's a really good album. I think they did better stuff, later in their career, but, this is a good start for them. An album that took me a couple of years to finally get around to checking out is Maybe I'll Catch Fire by Alkaline Trio. I'd listened to their debut album, God Damn It, and I really liked it. But I don't know why, but it was probably, this came out in 2000, so it was probably 2003, 2004 by the time I finally got around to listen to this one. And I love it. I don't think it's as good as their debut, but it's definitely up there. The next one is an album that has never had an official release on vinyl. It definitely needs one. Hopefully we'll see one this year. And that is There Anybody Out There by Pink Floyd. So this was this is The Wall Live, recorded in 1980 and 1981. It was recorded in August 1980 and then June of 1981 in London. The June 1981 performance was actually the last time all four members of Pink Floyd played together until, Live 8 in 2005. This is an unofficial pressing I picked up, I don't know, maybe a month or two back. And, it sounds really good, but like I said, I'd love to have an official release from the band for this album. Since they've sold their catalog, maybe we'll finally see something. So a lot of bands really struggle having to follow up a gigantic album. So No Doubt released Tragic Kingdom back in 1995. It was a huge hit. It was not only one of the biggest albums of that year, it was one of the biggest albums probably of the middle part of the decade. So when they followed that up with The Return of Saturn on April 11th, 2000, I was a little cautious. I liked a couple of the singles they released off of it, but it probably wasn't until the beginning part of 2001 when I actually finally got around to listening to it. I think it's a little more radio friendly than Tragic Kingdom. It still sold really well, sold over 2 million copies here in the US, hit number 2 on the Billboard 200. Also on April 11th, an album came out that I completely missed on. It wasn't until, I think within the last several years, that I finally listened to this album, and I love it. It's a great album, and that is a self-titled debut album from the Distillers. They're fronted by Brody Dahl, who is the ex-wife of Tim Armstrong, who's the lead singer of Rancid. And I think the best comparison I can make, the way I always describe this album is, if you like Hole, I think they're a good comparison, but they are much more aggressive. They are much better than anything that Hole ever did. Another album that took me a little while to get around listening to, this one came out on May 16th, and it was probably like the very end of 2000, maybe the beginning part of 2001 when I listened to it. And that is Binaural by Pearl Jam. This is the band's first album with Matt Cameron on drums, who of course was the drummer for Soundgarden. And it's, so they experimented with this binaural recording style, and it, the album has this almost like kind of atmosphere kind of sound to it, which the band didn't really have before. And the first couple of times I listened to it, I just didn't get it. And it's really grown on me since then. It's become probably one of my top 5 or 6 Pearl Jam albums. Another album that got released on May 16th is The Ever-Passing Moment by MXPX. I couldn't wait to get out of work that day and go to the store. I went to Best Buy, I believe, to pick this one up. It's a little more radio friendly than their earlier albums. I still think it's one of their best, though, produced by the legendary Jerry Finn. Hit number 56 on the Billboard 200. It's one I still play pretty regularly. And then 1 week later, on May 23rd, Eminem would release the Marshall Mathers LP, and I think really changed the trajectory of rap music in the early part of the 2000s. It received widespread critical acclaim, hit number 1 in a bunch of different countries. I think it sold like over 13 million copies here in the US. I still think it's one of the best rap albums of all time. And then on June 13th, NoFX would release Pump Up the Volume. This is their last album with Epitaph, and as a follow-up to their surprisingly successful So Long and Thanks for the Shoes, which I think is still their second best-selling album of all time. And, this is an album where it took me a little while. There's none of the big tracks from NoFX on this one. It took me a couple of listens to really get into this one, but, I still would put this up there with some of the best albums the band ever did. The funny thing is, when the album came out, I was like, that's not how you spell volume. And then I found out that the band intentionally did that just so they would not get sued over the title. It hit number 61 on the Billboard 200, which at that time was the highest charting album that NoFX had ever had. The next album is one where, it was met with some pretty mixed reviews, but I've always enjoyed this album. It had 3 big tracks off of it that I think got a lot of airplay. I think that's really kind of all anyone ever paid attention to on this album, but there's a lot of other really good tracks on this one. But it's Everclear, Songs from American Movie, Volume 1, Learning How to Smile. So Wonderful was the big track off here. AM Radio got a lot of airplay. And there's also a cover of Brown Eyed Girl by Van Morrison on this one. And this one wasn't available on vinyl until last year. Finally got a release. And it's one that, I hope, so this was released by Intervention. Intervention also released the first 2 albums from Everclear. Hopefully they continue on, because there's some other great albums that Everclear has that have never been available on vinyl. Surprisingly, this is the band's highest charting album of all time. It hit number 9 on the Billboard 200 here in the US, and this was their last platinum album also. Then we got to skip all the way ahead to September 26th when Good Charlotte would release their self-titled debut album. I love this album. I've long considered this one of the best punk albums of the 2000s. It was met with a lot of really great reviews, but commercially it didn't do as well as expected. This is one where, so this one came out in September. It was, I think, the very end of the year. Like right before this album got really huge, I saw the Good Charlotte open up for MXPX here in Detroit. I'd never heard of them before, hadn't heard any of their songs. And I remember, I was there with my wife. I remember, turning to her, I think it was 2 or 3 songs into the set. And I was like, man, this band's going to be huge. And look what they ended up doing the rest of their career. So I've been a big fan of Green Day ever since they released Dookie. And then on October 3rd, they released Warning. And to be honest, I was not impressed with this album the first several times I listened to it. From going from Dookie to Insomniac to Nimrod, there was still some very strong punk influences on those albums, and there really wasn't. That's probably their least punk album that they'd done up to that point. But it's definitely grown on me over the years. I do love a lot of the songs on this album. I would still rank this up in probably the top half of Green Day's discography, but I know that a lot of people that were Green Day fans, at least in my area, that were really disappointed with the direction the band took on this album. And then 3 weeks later, on October 24th, Linkin Park would release Hybrid Theory. And this is an album that I still consider probably the best debut album from anyone in the 2000s. And this is an album that took me a little while to listen to. It was probably the beginning part of 2001 when I bought this. And I don't think I left my CD player for at least several months. I listened to it front to back. There's not a bad song on here. Easily a 10 out of 10 album for me. And then a couple weeks later, on November 7th, one of my favorite live albums of all time got released. And that is Blink-182, the Mark, Tom, and Travis show. This was recorded over 2 nights in November of 1999 on the Enema of the State tour. I think this album does a really good job of capturing the energy that Blink-182 had in their live sets around this time. And, they've never been the greatest band live, but they do a really good job on this album. I think they picked the best versions of those songs to put on here. And this also does a really good job of showing the humor that has gone on between Tom and Mark over the years they still have today. And then the last album I got on my list was released on November 14th, and that's Conspiracy 1 by The Offspring. That's an album that is very much a symbol of its time. So around this time the album came out, The Offspring had come out in favor of Napster and in favor of file sharing. And actually, what the band wanted to do was release this album digitally on their website like a week or so before the launch of the album. The label said absolutely not. They threatened lawsuits. There was this big fight between them and the label. They end up pulling back and not doing that, but I think it's really kind of shows where music was at that time in 2000. It also helps that it's a great album. I would rank this as one of the top 3 or 4 albums from The Offspring. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what some of your favorite albums turning 25 in 2025 are. I could have went on. I think there's 14 or 15 I got here. I actually trimmed my list down from what it was. But let me know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep all spinning. Peace.